The millionaire's son cruelly humiliated the waitress in front of everyone. A minute later, he fell to his knees because of what his father did. The restaurant buzzed with the usual energy of a Friday evening crowd. Laughter, clinking glasses, and cheerful conversations filled the air, creating an ambience that spoke to the comfort and familiarity of an upscale dining experience. Sarah was bustling between tables, her notebook clutched tightly in one hand as she expertly balanced a tray of empty plates with the other. Her steps were quick but steady, her expression friendly and patient despite the high volume of customers. Then the group walked in. They were a lively bunch, obviously coming from some kind of celebration. Dressed in designer clothes, each of them carrying the casual confidence that money often bestows. But one of them, a young man with a sharp jawline, neatly styled hair, and an air of impatience, stood out more than the others. David. Sarah immediately recognized him. He was the son of one of the wealthiest real estate moguls in the city, a regular face in the gossip columns for his luxurious lifestyle and occasional, more reckless antics. Sarah walked over to their table, her professional smile on display. "Good evening. I'll be your server tonight. Can I start you off with something to drink?" David barely glanced at her, looking at the menu with a frown. "Are the ingredients here even fresh? This place looks like a downgrade from where I usually go." His friends chuckled uncomfortably, and Sarah kept her composure, only nodding politely. "Yes, sir. We use only fresh, locally sourced ingredients." David rolled his eyes. "Sure, whatever. Just get me sparkling water, and don't let it sit around for too long." Sarah noted his order, choosing to ignore his condescending tone. She moved on to the rest of the table, who placed their orders with much less attitude. As she left, she overheard David muttering to his friends, "Can you believe these people? Acting like they're doing us a favor when they can barely keep up with the pace in here." Sarah felt her face heat up as she walked back to the kitchen. She was no stranger to rude customers, but David's tone had a different bite to it. She took a deep breath, brushed off his comments, and focused on her job. After all, the evening rush demanded her full attention, and there was no time to dwell on one customer's words. As she brought the drinks to the table, David was already complaining to his friends about the menu options, loudly critiquing each dish and laughing at his own jokes. His friends seemed uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, glancing around as if hoping no one was overhearing them. Sarah handed David his sparkling water, only for him to glance at it with a smirk. "Is this really the best you have?" he scoffed, swirling the glass in his hand. "I can barely call this sparkling. At the places I go, this would be unacceptable. Do you even know how to serve this?" Her professional demeanor faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered, managing to keep her voice steady. "I'm sorry if it doesn't meet your expectations, sir. I can bring another one if you'd like." David scoffed. "Oh, don't bother. It's not like it'd make a difference. Just bring out the food, and try not to drop it." The snickers from his friends were quiet but present. Sarah nodded, though her patience was wearing thin. She continued serving other tables, trying not to let David's sneering glances and dismissive attitude bother her, but it felt like a test of her resilience every time she passed his table. The night stretched on, and David's complaints only grew louder and more absurd. Each dish she brought out was not up to par, not how it's supposed to look, or below his standards. He was relentless, picking at every small detail and making sure everyone around could hear his dissatisfaction. But Sarah kept her head down and carried on, even though her coworkers shot her sympathetic glances each time she walked past the counter. By the time dessert arrived, David's behavior had escalated. He made a show of inspecting each dish she served, lifting his nose and making exaggerated faces, laughing at her as though she was beneath him. Finally, he looked at her with a smug smile and said, "You know, maybe if you paid more attention to your work, you could be better at this. Maybe get a better job. Have you considered that?" There was a silence around their table. His friends looked away uncomfortably, and Sarah felt her composure waver, but she held her ground. "Thank you for the feedback, sir. I'll take it into consideration," she replied evenly, her tone calm despite the insult. David's smirk only grew. He had enjoyed every moment of the spectacle he had created, clearly thriving on the attention and the power he held over someone he deemed insignificant. He raised his voice just enough to ensure the tables around them could hear. "I mean, it's just sad, isn't it?" he said, laughing and addressing his friends. "Imagine having to put up with this, scraping by, pretending you're fine with everything." Sarah looked at him, her jaw tightening, but before she could respond, a new voice interrupted them. "David." The voice was firm and calm but carried a weight that cut through the noise. Sarah turned to see an older man standing by their table. He was tall and composed, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his expression unreadable. David's face went pale. "Dad?" His tone was uncertain, a hint of confusion and embarrassment creeping in. The man, his father, nodded and looked at Sarah with a kind but apologetic expression. "I'm sorry if my son has been causing you trouble." His words were measured, yet something in his tone carried a warning, one that didn't need to be loud to be effective. David swallowed, looking down at the table, all his bravado melting away in an instant. His friends were silent, avoiding eye contact as his father continued. "I didn't raise you to treat people like this, David," he said, his voice low but clear. "Apologize, now." David's face flushed, and he looked around, realizing that the other diners were watching the scene unfold. The weight of his father's words pressed down on him, and he found himself unable to muster his usual defiance. He looked at Sarah, avoiding her eyes, and muttered, "I'm sorry." Sarah stood there, momentarily stunned by the sudden shift, but she managed a polite nod. "Thank you, sir." David's father turned to him. "This isn't the first time I've heard of your behavior, but it will be the last. You'll be spending some time understanding what it means to work hard, and not in a boardroom or an office, but here." David's head shot up, shock and horror written across his face. "What, Dad? You can't be serious." But his father's expression didn't waver. He was deadly serious. David's friends shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, clearly sensing this was not a moment to interfere. His father looked at them with a polite but firm nod. "You can stay and finish your meal, but David will be staying back to learn a few things." With that, he gestured for David to follow him to the side, away from the table. Reluctantly, David stood up, casting one last glance at his friends, who seemed relieved to be left out of his impending lecture. Once they were out of earshot of the rest of the restaurant, David's father turned to him, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to see my own son behave this way?" His voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried a weight that David hadn't heard before. "You think money gives you the right to look down on people?" David struggled to respond, his usual confidence replaced by discomfort and embarrassment. "Dad, I was just joking around. It's not that serious." His father's expression hardened. "Do you think Sarah was laughing? Or the other people who had to listen to you belittle someone who's simply doing their job?" David remained silent, feeling the shame settle in as he realized he had no defense. His father let the silence linger, letting the weight of his words sink in fully before speaking again. "Since you seem so interested in how things run around here," he said finally, "you'll be spending the next few weeks working here. You'll learn what it means to be in their shoes." David's eyes widened in horror. "Dad, you can't be serious. I have plans, and I'm supposed to go on a trip with my friends next week." "Those plans are canceled. Effective immediately," his father said, his tone unwavering. "You'll report here tomorrow to start training. I've already spoken to the manager." David's mouth opened, but he couldn't find the words to argue. The stern look on his father's face left no room for negotiation. "Dad, please, I didn't mean to. Think about how you've acted, and maybe you'll understand why I'm doing this," his father said, turning away without another word. He walked back to the table, leaving David standing there, his heart racing as he processed the reality of what had just happened. The next morning, David stood outside the restaurant, his nerves on edge. The usual confidence he carried was replaced by an uncomfortable mix of dread and humility. He'd spent the night replaying his father's words, unable to ignore the sinking feeling that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The manager, a middle-aged woman named Linda, greeted him with a curt nod and handed him an apron. "Welcome to your first day, David. I hope you're ready to learn a few things." David swallowed, nodding. The rest of the staff watched him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, most of them having heard the story of his behavior from the night before. Sarah was among them, standing behind the counter with an unreadable expression. She nodded politely when he looked her way, but her eyes held none of the warmth she usually extended to customers. Linda led him to the back, explaining the basics of his tasks: clearing tables, restocking supplies, and assisting the servers whenever they needed help. He would start with the most basic work, a part of the team but far from the high-paying, prestigious job he was used to. David's shoulders slumped as he listened, realizing that this was his reality for the foreseeable future. By midday, he was exhausted. The physical demands of the job were far more intense than he'd imagined. His back ached from bending down to wipe tables. His arms were sore from carrying trays, and the endless stream of orders left him feeling more overwhelmed than he'd ever felt before. Sarah watched him struggle, offering him pointers when he seemed completely lost, though her tone remained professional, lacking any hint of sympathy. Despite his initial resentment, David found himself grateful for her guidance, especially as he began to understand just how challenging her job was. Over the following weeks, David's understanding of the work deepened. He found himself gaining a new respect for the staff he once dismissed so easily. Each night, he'd leave the restaurant exhausted, his clothes smelling of food and sweat, his hands calloused from scrubbing down tables and carrying trays. One evening, as he was cleaning up after the last rush of customers, he found himself standing next to Sarah in the kitchen. They worked in silence for a few moments before he finally spoke up. I'm sorry for the way I acted," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea how hard this was." Sarah paused, glancing at him. Her expression softened slightly. "Thank you for saying that, David. I hope this experience teaches you something." David nodded, feeling a sense of humility he hadn't felt in years. Working alongside the staff had given him a glimpse into a world he'd never understood. A world where every task mattered, where people worked tirelessly without the comfort of wealth and privilege. As the days turned into weeks, David's attitude shifted. He found himself genuinely caring about his work, not just because his father had forced him to, but because he had come to respect the people around him. His friendships with the staff grew, and he found himself learning from their stories, understanding their struggles, and realizing how deeply he'd misunderstood the world outside his bubble. By the end of his time at the restaurant, David was a changed person. He no longer saw people through the lens of wealth and status, but through the resilience and dignity they carried in their everyday lives. When his father came to visit him on his final shift, he looked at David with a hint of pride and relief. David felt a new resolve, a commitment to live with more empathy and humility. David's father observed his son's transformation over the weeks, quietly pleased with the change he was beginning to see. David had gone from viewing the restaurant staff as faceless people performing tasks around him to understanding each of them as individuals with stories, struggles, and strengths. He had come to respect Linda's tireless dedication as a manager, Sarah's patience and professionalism, and the back kitchen team's relentless pace to keep everything running smoothly. By the time his sentence was ending, David felt something bittersweet. The job he once dreaded now felt like a part of his routine, and he had developed a sense of camaraderie with his coworkers that he hadn't expected. One evening, when the restaurant was emptying out and they were preparing to close, Sarah noticed David standing quietly by the counter, lost in thought. "Something on your mind?" she asked as she wiped down a section of the bar. David glanced up, surprised. "Yeah, I guess I didn't think I'd feel this way. I never imagined well, miss this." Sarah gave him a slight smile, her eyes warm but thoughtful. "Funny how that happens. Sometimes we don't know what we're missing until we get a closer look. He nodded, looking around the restaurant, his mind drifting over the countless interactions and moments he'd experienced there. He'd witnessed the busy Friday night rushes, the early morning prep hours, the late night cleanups, things he never thought would matter to him. But now each part of the job carried meaning. A few minutes later, David's father walked in, quietly observing the restaurant's closing routine. David noticed him and walked over, still wearing his apron, his hands slightly reddened and rough from the hours of work he'd put in. His father's expression was unreadable, but David could sense something different in his gaze. "Well, David," his father said, glancing around, "I'm here to take you back. Your time here is over. But I trust you've learned a thing or two." David nodded slowly, glancing over at Sarah and the rest of the team. "More than I ever expected to, Dad." He turned to Sarah, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "Thank you for everything, Sarah. I know I wasn't the easiest to deal with, but you taught me a lot. All of you did." Sarah smiled, reaching out to give his arm a reassuring pat. "Take care, David. And don't forget what you've learned here." As he left the restaurant with his father, David felt a strange mixture of gratitude and humility. The experience had not only changed how he viewed others, but also how he viewed himself and his responsibilities. The world outside of wealth and privilege now felt real to him, and he felt a genuine desire to make a difference beyond the walls of his old life. As they reached the parking lot, his father placed a hand on his shoulder, looking at him with quiet pride. "You've come a long way, son. Don't let this lesson fade with time." David nodded, his resolve solidified. "I won't, I promise." David returned to his familiar life, but something fundamental within him had shifted. The experiences he'd had at the restaurant stayed with him in unexpected ways, influencing how he interacted with others and how he approached his own future. He was no longer drawn to the reckless lifestyle that once entertained him. Instead, he felt a newfound responsibility to put his privilege to meaningful use. A few weeks after finishing his time at the restaurant, David decided to visit his father's office. He walked in, the same confidence in his step, but with a different kind of purpose. His father looked up from his desk, raising an eyebrow as he saw David standing there with a determined look on his face. "Dad, I want to talk to you about the business," David began, sitting down across from him. "But not in the way I used to think about it." His father leaned back, intrigued. "Go on." David took a deep breath, recalling all the stories he'd heard from his coworkers at the restaurant. Stories of struggle, dreams, and hard work. "I want to make our company a place where people, no matter their background, can grow and be respected. I used to think of our employees as numbers, people who worked for us because they had no other choice. But I know now that they're the backbone of everything we do. They're the reason we succeed." His father studied him quietly, a hint of pride in his eyes. "So, what do you propose?" David's ideas flowed naturally, drawn from the experiences he'd had on the restaurant floor. He suggested implementing programs to support employees in need, providing opportunities for growth within the company, and ensuring that everyone who worked under their name was treated with dignity and respect. He wanted to create training programs, mentorships, and benefits that went beyond the standard expectations, building a culture where the values he'd learned could resonate at every level. After hearing him out, his father nodded thoughtfully. "I see you're serious about this." "I am," David replied. "I think I've wasted enough time not understanding what matters, and I'm ready to make a change, not just in the company but in how I live my life." Over the next few months, David threw himself into his new vision with the same vigor he once reserved for his privileged pursuits. He spent time visiting different branches of their business, speaking directly with employees, and learning about the challenges they faced. His empathy grew deeper with each conversation, reinforcing his determination to make a difference. He saw firsthand how meaningful work, recognition, and fair treatment could transform lives, just as his time at the restaurant had transformed him. One day, as he was reviewing the latest progress reports, he received a letter from Sarah. She had heard of the changes he was making and wanted to reach out. Her words were simple but full of encouragement, thanking him for taking what he'd learned and using it to make a real difference. David felt a wave of gratitude and humility, knowing that her influence, along with the experience his father had given him, had set him on a new path. His father watched David's growth with quiet satisfaction, proud to see his son evolving into someone he could respect and admire. The once spoiled and entitled young man had become a leader who valued others, a person driven by compassion rather than ego. In time, David's work not only reshaped the company's culture but also inspired other businesses to follow suit, creating a ripple effect in the industry. He had come full circle, turning what had once been a humiliating experience into a catalyst for personal growth and a legacy he could be proud of. And in every decision he made, every life he touched, he carried with him the lessons he'd learned from Sarah and the rest of the restaurant staff, a reminder of where he'd started and who he had become. As David's influence grew within the company, so did his vision. He launched a series of initiatives designed to support employees beyond their immediate work roles, especially focusing on the hourly and entry-level staff he had once disregarded. These programs included comprehensive healthcare options, childcare support, and financial literacy workshops, as he knew many employees faced challenges he'd never understood before his time at the restaurant. David also organized scholarship funds and mentorship programs, giving employees and their families access to educational resources and opportunities that could change the trajectory of their lives. He wanted to create a legacy of genuine care and empowerment within the company, a far cry from the person he had once been, concerned only with personal gain and status. It wasn't long before his father noticed the ripple effect these changes were creating. Employees who had once merely clocked in and out of work were now engaged, motivated, and loyal to the company. Productivity rose, turnover rates dropped, and the company's reputation blossomed as a place where people genuinely wanted to work. Competitors began to take notice, and soon David was fielding calls from other leaders in the industry who were curious about his approach and the unexpected success it had brought. One evening, David hosted a company event to celebrate the achievements of the past year, inviting employees from all levels to join. As he stood at the front of the room, surrounded by people who had once been strangers to him, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and fulfillment. He addressed the room, his voice steady and sincere. "I want to thank each of you," he began, his gaze moving across the audience, recognizing the faces of people who'd shared their stories with him, people who had become the foundation of his new perspective. "You are the reason this company thrives. You've shown me the true meaning of hard work, resilience, and community. And because of you, I am a better person." The crowd applauded, and David felt a sense of pride, knowing that his journey had not only changed him, but had become a force for good in others' lives. After his speech, as people congratulated him, Sarah walked up to him, a gentle smile on her face. They hadn't seen each other since his time at the restaurant, but she had followed his progress with quiet admiration. "You've come a long way, David," she said, extending her hand. David shook her hand warmly, humbled by her presence. "Thank you, Sarah. You're one of the reasons I'm standing here today. I'll never forget what you taught me." She nodded, her expression reflecting pride and gratitude. "I always knew you had it in you. I just think you needed the chance to see it for yourself." As they stood there, he realized how far he had come, from a young man consumed by wealth and ego to someone driven by purpose and compassion. His life now held meaning that extended beyond himself, and he felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment he'd never known before. David's transformation didn't just impact his company. It inspired others to rethink what success meant. He became a prominent figure in the industry, known not only for his wealth but for his integrity and compassion. And though he would continue to build his business, his true legacy was one of kindness, humility, and the understanding that, regardless of status or wealth, every person deserves respect and dignity. In the years that followed, David often reflected on his journey. He knew he would never have reached this point without the difficult lesson his father had taught him that night in the restaurant. It was a lesson that had reshaped his life, his company, and his legacy. one that reminded him always of where he had started and how he had changed. David's life continued along this renewed path, but his dedication to growth didn't stop at transforming his company. He became increasingly involved in community efforts, realizing that true success wasn't confined within the walls of his own business. He established partnerships with local organizations to provide resources and job training for underprivileged communities, offering internships and apprenticeships that allowed people from diverse backgrounds to step into roles they may have never thought possible. One of his most impactful initiatives was a program he created to help youth from low-income families gain work experience in a supportive environment. David funded this program himself, providing young adults with stipends, mentorship, and resources to help them succeed. He saw pieces of his younger self in many of them, people who hadn't yet been exposed to the realities of hard work, self-discovery, or personal growth. And, through his guidance, he aimed to give them the opportunities he had taken for granted. His dedication did not go unnoticed. The media soon began to cover his philanthropic efforts, calling him a new generation leader who combined business acumen with a heart for social good. But for David, the recognition wasn't what mattered. What mattered were the letters he received from former interns who thanked him for giving them their first real shot, from employees who told him how their lives had changed, and from parents who appreciated the stability and support his initiatives had brought to their families. One day, as he was leaving his office, he received a surprise visit from his father. Though they had grown closer over the years, his father rarely visited him at work. They exchanged a warm greeting, and his father gestured for them to sit. "I've watched everything you've done, David," his father said, his voice full of pride. "You've built something far greater than anything I could have imagined. I always hoped you'd find a way to use your talents, but I never expected this." David felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Dad. I don't think I'd have gotten here without that lesson you taught me. Working at the restaurant, it changed everything for me." His father nodded, his gaze steady. "Sometimes the greatest lessons are the hardest to learn. I didn't know if you would take it to heart, but watching you grow and make something of yourself, something real, I know now that it was the best decision I ever made." They shared a rare, heartfelt moment, one that encapsulated the depth of their journey as father and son. What had once been a relationship built on expectations and status had transformed into one rooted in mutual respect, love, and understanding. Years later, David's name had become synonymous with compassion-driven leadership. He never forgot the lessons he'd learned, and he spent his life working to honor them. In every initiative, every new employee he welcomed, every struggling young person he helped, he saw a reflection of himself, the person he had been, and the person he had chosen to become. And as he looked around the thriving business he'd built, surrounded by people who shared his vision and values, David felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had once thought that success was measured by wealth and status. But now, he knew that true success was measured by the lives he touched, the people he helped, and the legacy he would leave behind. A legacy defined by kindness, humility, and the relentless pursuit of positive change. As David's journey continued, he found himself returning to the restaurant where it had all begun. This time, he wasn't there as a boss's son or even as a customer. He was there to express his gratitude. He wanted to reconnect with the people who had unknowingly shaped the man he had become, the people who had shown him the meaning of respect, resilience, and genuine hard work. Walking through the doors, David saw that not much had changed. The familiar sounds and smells brought back a rush of memories of those challenging weeks, of Sarah's quiet encouragement, and of his father's stern, life-altering lesson. He spotted Linda, the manager, still holding court in her domain, and Sarah, busy serving tables with the same calm efficiency he remembered. As he approached them, Sarah looked up and recognized him, a smile spreading across her face. "David," she greeted him warmly, setting down her tray. "It's been a while." Linda came over, crossing her arms with a playful smirk. "Well, look who's back. Here to scrub a few tables? Or is it just a social call?" David laughed, feeling the warmth of their teasing. "I actually came by to say thank you. To both of you," he said, his tone sincere. "What you did for me here." showing me how much I had to learn. It's something I'll never forget." They listened, smiling, both of them clearly proud to see how far he had come. "We all start somewhere," Linda said gently. "You just had to take a different path to find your way." David spent the afternoon with them, chatting and reminiscing, sharing stories about how the lessons he'd learned here had shaped his life and the company he now ran. He even insisted on helping with a few tables, laughing as he stumbled over simple tasks he'd once mastered. For a moment, he was that young man again, eager and humbled, reminded of the roots he'd established here. As he left the restaurant that evening, David felt an immense sense of gratitude. He knew that he was walking away not only as a better man but as someone who understood the depth of the values he now lived by. And in his heart, he knew that this humble place would forever be the foundation of everything he had built. In the years that followed, David's work continued to inspire others. He became a speaker, sharing his story at conferences and events, hoping to teach others what he had learned about humility, respect, and the importance of treating every person with dignity. And every time he spoke, he found himself thinking back to the restaurant, to Sarah, to Linda, and to his father's unwavering resolve. Their lessons would live on through his words, his actions, and, most importantly, through the countless lives he touched along the way. David's legacy grew beyond his own achievements. He had sparked a movement, a shift in the way businesses approached leadership and the treatment of their employees. And though his journey had been long and unexpected, he knew, deep down, that he had finally found the true purpose he had been searching for all along. David's journey left a deep, lasting impact on his company, but the ripples of change didn't stop there. The story of his transformation spread throughout the business world, igniting conversations in boardrooms, inspiring new management practices, and reshaping corporate values in ways he hadn't anticipated. Articles were written about the David Henderson model, as it became known, a leadership style built on compassion, understanding, and equality. Business schools began including his story in their curricula, and aspiring leaders studied his approach as an alternative to traditional, profit-centered management styles. With every accolade and mention, David felt humbled, knowing the journey hadn't been a carefully crafted strategy, but the result of a humbling experience that had changed him to his core. The restaurant he had once dreaded working at was now a cherished symbol of his evolution. The people he'd met there, the mentors, the friends, the colleagues who had guided him, were part of his life woven into the fabric of his story. One summer, David decided to host a reunion event at the very same restaurant. He invited Linda, Sarah, and all of his former co-workers, as well as his father, who had originally orchestrated the lesson. The restaurant had since undergone a few updates, but the core of its warm, inviting atmosphere remained the same. It was a place where people felt valued and where memories were cherished. On the night of the event, David arrived early, hoping to soak in the surroundings before the others arrived. The familiar layout, the smell of fresh coffee, and the clatter of silverware against plates brought back a flood of memories, both the difficult and the enlightening. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for his own transformation but for the chance he'd been given to learn from others. Linda arrived first, her face lighting up when she saw David standing near the door. They embraced warmly, sharing a knowing smile that held years of mutual respect. She took a moment to look him over, laughing softly. "You clean up well," she teased, though her voice was filled with pride. David laughed, shaking his head. "I don't think I'll ever fully be able to thank you, Linda. You set me straight in ways no one else could." Linda patted his shoulder, her gaze kind but steady. "You did the work, David. I just made sure you didn't back down." Shortly after, Sarah arrived, along with a few other former staff members who'd stayed in touch with David over the years. They gathered around a large table, reminiscing about their time together, laughing over stories of kitchen mishaps, difficult customers, and the camaraderie that had bound them all together. David's father, who had been watching from a distance, joined them, taking in the sight of his son, surrounded by people who had become lifelong friends. As they shared stories, David took the opportunity to tell them about his life since his time at the restaurant, about the employees he'd helped, the programs he'd created, and the way their lessons had become the cornerstone of his work. He spoke openly about how he'd once lived in a bubble, unaware of the challenges others faced, and how that had all changed because of the people at this table. "I owe all of you more than I can say," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You taught me that true respect is earned, not bought, and that there's more value in kindness and integrity than in anything money can buy." There was a moment of quiet reflection around the table. Then Linda, ever the practical one, smiled and said, "Well, at least you finally learned to clear a table properly. That alone is worth celebrating." Everyone laughed, and David felt a profound sense of belonging. He realized that this was more than just a gathering. It was a reminder of the family he had gained through that life-changing experience. As the evening wore on, David pulled his father aside for a private conversation. The two of them stepped out into the cool night air, away from the laughter and music inside. David looked at his father, his face illuminated by the streetlight, and felt a surge of gratitude he could barely put into words. "Dad, I never thanked you properly for what you did," he began, his voice slightly choked with emotion. "You didn't have to do what you did, but because of it, I became the person I am today." His father, who had watched David's transformation with quiet pride, put a hand on his shoulder. "I saw the potential in you, David. I knew that underneath everything you had a good heart. You just needed to find your way to it." David nodded, deeply moved. "You gave me that chance, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to live up to it." As they walked back inside, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. This gathering wasn't just about looking back. It was about moving forward, carrying the values he had learned with him every step of the way. Over the following years, David continued to grow his legacy, both within his company and beyond. He dedicated his time to mentorship, working closely with young leaders to help them understand the importance of empathy and responsibility. He traveled around the country, speaking to students and aspiring entrepreneurs, sharing his story openly and honestly, never shying away from the difficult parts. He wanted them to see that humility and self-awareness were strengths, not weaknesses. One of his most significant achievements came when he launched the Henderson Foundation, a nonprofit focused on workforce development, education, and social programs for underserved communities. He dedicated the foundation to Linda, Sarah, and the restaurant team, acknowledging them as the true architects of his success. The foundation became a beacon of hope for countless people, helping them find meaningful work, pursue education, and build better lives for their families. David's foundation even established partnerships with high schools and colleges, offering scholarships and internships to students from low-income backgrounds, ensuring they had the resources to achieve their dreams. He frequently visited these schools, speaking directly with students, sharing his story, and encouraging them to see the value in hard work and respect for others. In time, David's impact became so widespread that he was recognized nationally, receiving awards and honors for his dedication to social change and compassionate leadership. But each time he stood on a stage, accepting an award or delivering a speech, he felt the presence of the people who had taught him, guiding his words, reminding him of the foundation upon which he had built his life. In his later years, David often returned to that restaurant, sometimes alone, sometimes with his family. He found solace there, in the place where his journey had truly begun. He would sit by the window, sipping his coffee and watching the hustle and bustle around him, feeling a deep peace settle over him. He knew that he had lived a life he could be proud of, a life of meaning and purpose. And as he looked out at the world, he felt certain that the legacy he left behind, a legacy built on kindness, respect, and a commitment to others, would endure long after he was gone. David Henderson's story became a symbol of redemption, humility, and the power of human connection. His journey reminded the world that, regardless of where we start, it's never too late to learn, to grow, and to make a positive impact on those around us. As David grew older, his influence spread far beyond his company, touching lives in ways he had never expected. He had become a role model, not only for other business leaders but also for ordinary people who found inspiration in his journey. His story was one of humility and redemption, and it resonated deeply with people across backgrounds. Young people who heard him speak were moved by his sincerity, by the way he openly admitted his flaws and mistakes, and by his unwavering commitment to helping others find their own paths. One winter evening, David received an invitation to speak at a prestigious leadership conference in New York. He stood before a packed auditorium filled with corporate executives, students, and aspiring entrepreneurs. As he looked out at the crowd, he felt a sense of responsibility, knowing that he had the chance to shape how these leaders viewed their own power and privilege. He began his speech with a story he'd shared many times before, the story of the night in the restaurant when he'd humiliated Sarah, and how his father had forced him to learn a lesson that would change his life forever. As he recounted the story, the audience was silent, hanging on his every word, moved by the vulnerability with which he spoke. David shared how that experience had shaped every decision he'd made since, guiding him in building a company centered on empathy, respect, and compassion. True leadership isn't about power or profit, he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. It's about lifting others, about understanding that everyone you encounter has a story, a struggle, and a worth that isn't defined by status or wealth. The greatest impact you can make is through kindness and humility. After his speech, a young man approached him, visibly emotional. He introduced himself as Alex and explained that he had recently started his own business but had been struggling with his identity as a leader. "Listening to you tonight," Alex said, his voice thick with emotion, "made me realize that I've been looking at success all wrong. I've been so focused on growth and profit that I forgot why I started in the first place, to make a difference." David put a hand on Alex's shoulder. "It's never too late to redefine what success means to you. Stay true to your values, and the impact you make will be far more meaningful than any profit margin." That night, David returned to his hotel feeling a profound sense of purpose. He knew that every person he inspired was another ripple of positive change, a chance to spread the lessons he had learned. As he lay awake, he thought about how different his life had turned out from what he had once envisioned. Instead of merely achieving personal success, he had helped create a movement, a wave of change that reached far beyond himself. Back home, David continued his work through the Henderson Foundation, which had grown to become a major force for good. The foundation supported education, housing, and healthcare initiatives in underserved communities, and it had even expanded internationally, building schools, providing clean water, and supporting small businesses in impoverished areas. The foundation's programs helped thousands of families, and every project bore David's original guiding principles: respect, dignity, and opportunity for all. One of his most cherished projects was a vocational training program designed for young people coming from challenging backgrounds. David personally visited these training centers, talking with students, learning their stories, and offering them advice. Many of them reminded him of his younger self, filled with dreams but unsure of how to navigate the world ahead of them. He made sure they felt seen, respected, and understood, just as he had once needed to feel. As he walked through one of the training centers one day, he spotted a familiar face: Sarah, now a program director at the Henderson Foundation, working with students to help them find careers in hospitality and beyond. She had come full circle, moving from her role at the restaurant to a career dedicated to guiding others, and David couldn't have been prouder to see her thriving. Together, they had built something that would endure, something that would continue to change lives for generations. One evening, David sat down with his father, who had been a steady presence throughout his journey. Now in his later years, his father looked at David with a deep sense of pride, knowing that the lesson he had once taught his son had blossomed into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. "David," his father said, his voice soft but firm, "you've done something truly remarkable. You've built more than a business. You've built a legacy that will outlive us both." David nodded, his heart full. "It all started because of you, Dad. You believed in me when I couldn't see my own potential." His father smiled, his eyes filled with emotion. "Sometimes all someone needs is a chance to see themselves differently. I knew you had it in you, David. You just had to find it for yourself." As the years passed, David's influence continued to spread, and his foundation grew even stronger. He devoted his life to service, finding fulfillment in every life he touched, every community he uplifted, and every person he inspired. And when he finally stepped back from public life, he did so knowing that he had left the world a better place than he had found it. In his later years, David would often visit that same restaurant, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends or family, reliving memories and reconnecting with the roots of his journey. The restaurant remained a special place, a symbol of his transformation. The staff there knew him well, and they always welcomed him warmly, aware that he was a part of their story just as much as they were a part of his. On his last visit, David sat by the window, sipping a cup of coffee, watching the world go by. He reflected on the legacy he'd built and the lives he had touched, feeling an immense sense of peace and gratitude. The young man who had once walked through those doors, brimming with arrogance and entitlement, was now a man who understood the value of humility, the power of kindness, and the true meaning of success. David Henderson's story became more than just a personal tale. It became a symbol of hope and redemption, a reminder that it's never too late to change, to grow, and to make a positive impact. His life was a testament to the fact that one small moment of humility could spark a lifetime of meaningful change. And in the end, David's legacy lived on, not just in the business he had built or the foundation he had created, but in the countless lives he had touched, the people he had inspired, and the world he had made better simply by choosing a different path. As David entered the final chapters of his life, his work continued to flourish in ways he hadn't anticipated. The Henderson Foundation had grown into one of the most respected philanthropic organizations in the country, known for its hands-on approach to community building and empowerment. People from all walks of life looked to David's story as a reminder of what one person could achieve when they committed to making a positive difference. He was celebrated not only for his accomplishments but for the authenticity and humility he had shown along the way. One fall afternoon, David was invited to a special event held at one of the vocational schools he had helped establish through the foundation. The school, located in an underserved part of the city, provided young people with job training, mentorship, and scholarships to pursue higher education. It was a place filled with hope and opportunity, and for David, it represented the culmination of everything he had worked for. The students, faculty, and community leaders had gathered in the auditorium to celebrate the school's achievements, but they had also prepared a surprise for David. As he sat in the front row, watching the students perform a skit about their dreams and ambitions, the school principal took the stage, inviting David to join her. She handed him a plaque, inscribed with words that brought tears to his eyes. For David Henderson, who taught us that every journey has the power to inspire, and every act of kindness has the power to change lives. The principal spoke about the impact the school had made on the students and the community. Because of you, David, these young people have a future they can believe in. Your commitment to giving back has opened doors, created opportunities, and changed countless lives. And today, we honor you not just as a philanthropist, but as a friend, a mentor, and a guiding light. The audience erupted into applause, and David felt overwhelmed by the recognition, his heart full as he looked out over the crowd. Each face represented a dream, a future that might have once seemed out of reach, and he was humbled to know he had played a part in making those dreams possible. As he accepted the plaque, he took a moment to address the students. "When I was younger, I made mistakes that I thought I could never recover from," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But life has a way of giving us second chances. Every one of you has the power to create your own story, to overcome your challenges, and to make a difference in the world. Never let anyone tell you that you can't change, grow, or rise above your circumstances." After the event, students and staff members approached him, thanking him, sharing their own stories of struggle and hope. David listened intently, recognizing pieces of his own journey in each of their words. He could see how far he'd come, and he felt immense gratitude for the privilege of being part of something so much bigger than himself. Back at home, David continued to reflect on his life and the legacy he had created. He knew that his work would endure long after he was gone, carried on by the foundation, the schools, and the countless people he had inspired. He began to write a memoir, detailing his journey from entitlement and arrogance to humility and purpose, hoping that his story might inspire others to embrace change and pursue lives of meaning. His memoir, From Privilege to Purpose, became a bestseller, read by people from all backgrounds who saw in his words the potential for redemption and growth. Schools, nonprofits, and businesses adopted it as a teaching tool, and young leaders found encouragement in his honesty and his message of resilience. The book brought new waves of change as readers took his lessons to heart, spreading kindness and compassion in their own communities. In the later years of his life, David spent more time with his family, often telling his grandchildren stories of his journey and the people who had helped shape him. He wanted them to understand that success wasn't about wealth or status but about character, integrity, and the impact they could make on others. One day, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Sarah came to visit. They hadn't seen each other in a while, but the bond they shared remained as strong as ever. They spent hours talking, reminiscing about the days at the restaurant, the lessons they had learned, and the lives they had touched. Sarah looked at David, her gaze filled with pride and affection. "You did something incredible, David. You took the lessons from that restaurant and turned them into a legacy that will last for generations." David smiled, his heart full. "I wouldn't be here without you, Sarah. You showed me what respect and resilience looked like, even when I didn't deserve it. I hope I've honored that." "You have," she replied, taking his hand. "More than you'll ever know." As night fell, David felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that his life had been one of growth, change, and purpose, and he was grateful for every step of the journey. He had taken a difficult lesson and turned it into a life of meaning, and in doing so, he had created a legacy that would continue to inspire others long after he was gone. In his final years, David's influence only grew, but his focus remained on the people he had helped, the communities he had uplifted, and the lives he had touched. He spent his days quietly, surrounded by family and friends, knowing that he had fulfilled his purpose. And when he passed, his legacy lived on, a testament to the power of humility, kindness, and the courage to change. The Henderson Foundation continued its work, expanding into new areas, providing support to communities in need, and honoring David's vision of a world where everyone was treated with respect and dignity. His memoir became a classic, read by generations who found in his words a message of hope and redemption. David's story became more than just a tale of personal growth. It became a beacon of possibility for those who believed in the power of change, a reminder that no matter where we start, we have the capacity to make a positive impact on the world. And so, David Henderson's legacy endured, touching lives, inspiring kindness, and showing the world that true success lies in the difference we make in others' lives. He had once been the millionaire's son who thought the world was his to command, but he left the world as a humble, compassionate man who understood that the greatest wealth was found in the lives he had uplifted and the world he had helped to heal. After David's passing, the world continued to honor his legacy in ways that would carry his impact far into the future. His family, inspired by his life's work, took up the reins of the Henderson Foundation, each generation adding its own contributions to the organization's mission of compassion and opportunity. Guided by David's principles, the foundation began expanding into international initiatives, focusing on global education, healthcare access, and sustainable development in underserved areas. David's family made sure that every decision reflected his values, preserving the culture of kindness, respect, and integrity he had worked so hard to create. Schools around the world added David's memoir, From Privilege to Purpose, to their reading lists. It became especially popular in business ethics courses, inspiring young leaders to rethink what it meant to succeed. The memoir wasn't just a story about one man's journey. It had become a handbook for responsible leadership, a roadmap for building businesses that value people as much as profit. One particular story in the memoir, the scene where David's father had made him work at the restaurant, struck a chord with readers. Many parents, educators, and mentors used the story as a teaching tool, encouraging young people to experience the value of hard work and humility. The restaurant itself became a historical landmark, known as the place where kindness began. Locals and tourists alike visited to see where David's journey had started, and the restaurant embraced its role in his legacy, dedicating a wall to his memory, complete with photos, quotes, and stories from people he had inspired. The annual David Henderson Award for Empathy and Leadership was established, awarded to individuals and organizations that demonstrated exceptional commitment to community service, compassion, and ethical leadership. The award became one of the most prestigious honors in the business world, and recipients often spoke about the profound influence David's story had on their approach to leadership. Each award ceremony was a celebration not only of the recipient's achievements but of the values David had championed throughout his life. One day, years after his passing, a young woman named Mia, a graduate of one of the Henderson Foundation scholarship programs, stood at a podium to accept the David Henderson Award. Mia had started a nonprofit focused on mental health resources for underserved communities, a cause close to her heart due to her own struggles growing up. As she addressed the audience, she spoke about the impact David's legacy had on her journey. David Henderson's story taught me that true success lies in lifting others up, she said, her voice filled with emotion. His kindness and humility changed lives, including mine. Today, I stand here because of his vision, his compassion, and the opportunities he created for people like me. I hope to carry forward his message, to remind others that one act of kindness can change a life. The crowd gave her a standing ovation, and Mia's words reverberated through the room. She had become one of many who had been transformed by David's legacy, and she knew that her own work was part of his enduring impact. Her nonprofit grew in the years that followed, reaching thousands of people and inspiring others to approach mental health with empathy and understanding. David's influence lived on in Mia's work, just as it did in countless other lives he had touched. Meanwhile, the Henderson Foundation continued to evolve, expanding into new fields like environmental sustainability and digital education, adapting to the needs of a changing world. David's grandchildren, inspired by their grandfather's story, joined the foundation, bringing fresh ideas and perspectives. They traveled to different communities, meeting with the people their programs served, learning their stories, and finding new ways to make a positive impact. One of David's grandsons, James, felt a deep connection to his grandfather's story and took on the task of ensuring that David's lessons reached even the most distant corners of the world. He organized partnerships with local leaders in developing countries, working alongside them to create job training programs, healthcare services, and educational resources. Everywhere he went, James carried his grandfather's message of humility and kindness, finding new ways to bring it to life in each community he visited. Years later, when James was asked about his motivation, he reflected on his grandfather's legacy. "My grandfather taught me that our lives aren't defined by our titles or our wealth, but by the kindness we show and the lives we touch. His journey taught me that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter where we start. And if I can bring even a fraction of his impact into the world, then I'll know I've done something meaningful." David's legacy continued to grow, becoming a part of countless lives and inspiring generations who came long after he was gone. Schools, businesses, nonprofits, and communities carried forward his message, each interpreting it in ways that fit their unique needs and challenges. His name became synonymous with compassion-driven leadership, and his story remained a symbol of transformation and redemption, a reminder that no one is beyond the reach of change and that humility is the foundation of greatness. On what would have been David's 100th birthday, his family organized a memorial event attended by people from all over the world. Colleagues, friends, family members, and beneficiaries of his foundation gathered to celebrate the life of a man whose journey from privilege to purpose had inspired millions. The event was held at the very restaurant where his transformation began, and his family shared stories of his life, his lessons, and the lives he had changed. As the event drew to a close, James took the stage, holding back tears as he looked out over the crowd. "My grandfather's life was a testament to the power of humility and the courage to change," he said, his voice filled with pride. "He taught us that kindness is the most enduring legacy we can leave, and that every person has a story worth respecting. His journey is now our journey, and we carry forward his message with love, honor, and gratitude. The crowd rose to their feet in applause, their hearts full of admiration for a man who had lived his life with integrity and purpose. As they filed out of the restaurant, each person carried with them a piece of David's legacy, a commitment to kindness, a dedication to compassion, and the understanding that true success is measured not by what we gain but by what we give. David Henderson's story became a legend, passed down from generation to generation. His legacy was immortalized in books, taught in schools, celebrated in businesses, and, most importantly, lived out in the actions of people who believed in the power of kindness. And as the years passed, his message of humility, respect, and the courage to change continued to light the way for all who sought to make a difference, reminding the world that true greatness is found in the lives we touch. David Henderson's life journey from entitlement to humility left a legacy that reshaped the lives of countless individuals and transformed the very essence of leadership. In his early years, he had once believed success lay solely in wealth and status, but through a humbling experience and the lessons he learned from those he once overlooked, he came to understand the deeper, more profound value of kindness, respect, and service to others. In his later years, David's impact reached across communities, businesses, and families, inspiring generations to look beyond personal gain and embrace a life driven by purpose and empathy. His foundation thrived, his memoir became a guide for responsible leadership, and his name grew synonymous with compassionate change. His family, friends, and colleagues carried forward his vision, each one touched by the values he lived by. And though David Henderson eventually passed, his story endured, living on in the hearts of those he had influenced. His life became a beacon of possibility, showing that change is always within reach, and that the most powerful legacy we can leave is built not by the wealth we accumulate, but by the lives we uplift and the kindness we show. In the end, David's legacy became not only a story of redemption, but a reminder that greatness is measured by the compassion we bring into the world, and that each of us holds the power to make a lasting difference.